Hello and welcome back to Tech and EduSpark Hub, where technology meets education. In today's lesson, we'll be looking at the function of real variable, and under this lesson, we'll be looking at what function of real variable is, domain of a function, the inverse function, and lastly, we'll be looking at the composite function. So please, before you watch this video, hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and comment or share this video. And lastly, don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any lesson updates from Tech and EduSpark Hub. So stick with me to the end and let's enjoy the best out of the lesson. So what do we understand by the function of a real variable? So by definition, the function of a variable is a rule that assigns a number x to a set, also known as domain, to exactly a real number y. So let me just put that down. So this is a simple definition of the function of a real variable. It is a rule that assigns a number x in a set, also known as domain, to exactly a real number y. So this is the simple definition. And mathematically, we have f where f is a function of all real number. So this is the mathematical representation of function of real variable, and we have y to be equal to function of x. So you can see this y is what? The real number. While this f is a function of all real number, and this x is a what? Is the number assigned. So we have our s as the what? Independent variable. And our y as the dependent variable. And we have our domain, which is the what? The maximum number x can take. And lastly, we have our range, which is the possible value of f of x. So this is all to note about the function of a real variable. So you can see we have y is equal to f of x, where x is the what? Independent variable, which means the value of this y depends on what? X, because x is independent, but y is a dependent variable. So the number of y depends on the value of x. And we have the domain, which is the what? The maximum number x can take. And lastly, we have the range. The range is the what? The possible value of what? This f of x. So that is the range. So now let's look at some examples under the function of a real variable. So the first example as displayed on the screen says that if f of x is equal to 2x plus 3, find f of x when x is equal to 1. So how do we solve this kind of question? Remember that we are giving f of x to be equal to what? 2x plus 3. So now they are asking us to calculate f of x when x is equal to 1. So all we just have to do is to substitute x for 1 whenever we see x in f of x. So what this means is that whenever you see x here, you substitute it for what? 1. So how do we do this? We can say f of what? So whenever we see x, we will substitute it for 1. So we have x equals to 1. So this will be f of 1 to be equal to what? 2 open brackets 1 plus 3. So our f of 1 will be equal to what? 2 multiplied by 1 will give us 2 plus 3. So our f of 1 will be equal to 5. And this is given as our final answer to question of this type. So this is how we solve questions under function of real variable. So let's look at another example and see what we can do with that. Moving to the second example, the second example as displayed on the screen says that if f of x is equal to 3x minus 2, find f of 4. So let's just write this down. So we have the second example. So can you try to attempt this before I solve this kind of question? So pause this video and try this question, and when I solve it, you mark yourself if you are correct or wrong. So in solving this kind of question, we're given our f of x to be equal to 3x minus 2, and we're asked to find what? F of 4. So what this means is that whenever we see x, we will substitute it for what? 4 in this kind of equation. So we have our f of 4. You can see we have substitute x for 4 to be equal to what? Whenever we see x, we substitute it for what? 4. So we have 3 open bracket 4 minus 2. So in this case, our f of 4 will be equal to what? 3 multiplied by 4 will give us 12. So we have 12 minus 2. So our f of 4 will be equal to 10. And this is our final answer to question of this type. So f of 4 to this equation is what? 10. So option A is correct to this kind of question. So this will be all about function of real variable. Next up, let's look at the domain of a function. And moving to the domain of a function, what do we understand by the domain of a function? From here, I said the domain is what? The maximum value or the maximum number s can take. So let me just write that down. So the domain, so again, the domain is the possible value of x for which the function is divine. So what do we understand by divine and undivine? So when they say a function is divine, that means that the function must not be divided by 0. Do you get? So like now, if we have something like 1 divided by 0, we'll get something of undefined. So that means that the function of x or the possible value of x must be equal to something that will not give us what? Undefined. So that is why we have the domain is a possible value of x for which what? The function is defined. So the function must be defined and not undefined. So if you still have something like 0 divided by 1, this will give you 0 and it is a real number. It is still divined. So anything that you are doing under domain, it must not be divisible by what? By 0, so that you won't get what? Undefined. And that is why we have a possible value of x for which what? The function is defined. So let's look at some examples under this domain of a function. So here is the first example we have under the domain of a function. The question says if f of x is equal to 1 divided by x minus 3, find the domain of x. So in order to solve this question, remember that we said when finding a domain, your denominator must not be equal to what? 0, because if it is equal to 0, we are going to get undefined. So what you just have to do is to look for what? The where x is in this equation. So we can see where x is what? The denominator. So we have x minus 3. So all you just have to do is to pick that x minus 3. So we have x minus 3, and you now say must not be equal to 0. So in this kind of question, all you just have to do is to take x what? To the opposite direction, and it will become what? The positive sign. So we have x must not be equal to what? 0 plus 3. So we have x must not be equal to what? 3. So our domain is what? So this is our domain to this kind of question, and this is how to solve questions under domain of a function. So our domain is 3, which means what? X must not be equal to 3, because take for example, if x is equal to 3, we have 3 minus 3, and that will give us what? 0. So our function become what? Undefined, and we don't want our function to become undefined, and that is why we have to look for the domain. So we can say that the maximum or the possible value of x must not be equal to what? 3. So you can still have 2 as x, you can have 1 as x, but it must not be equal to 3, because that is the domain of the function. So the domain is allowing us not to get what? Undefined as our answer. So the domain of this kind of question is what? Is 3. And that is how to solve question of this type. So let's look at another example still on the domain of a function. So moving to the second example as displayed on the screen, the question says if f of x is equal to 1 over x squared minus 4, find what? The domain of x. So let me just write that down. So we have f of x. So how do we solve question of this type? Recall that this question is different from the first question because this is having a power, unlike the first one that is not having a power. I said whenever you want to solve any question under domain, just look at the question and pick out where there is x equation in the question. So in this case, this is our x equation, which is what? X squared minus 4. So we have our x squared minus 4, and we say must not be equal to what? 0. So this is how to calculate our domain. So x squared minus 4 must not be equal to what? 0. So in this kind of question, how do we get our x? You can see that this is a what? A power, which is 2, and this is not having any power. So we can convert this to what? A difference of 2 squared. If you remember what difference of 2 squares is. So you can just say x squared minus what? 2 squared must not be equal to what? 0. So in calculating the difference of 2 squared, we have a general formula, which is what? So we have a plus b, also we have a minus b. So this is what you use in calculating what? The difference of 2 squared. So how do we input this, our parameter, to this formula? So you can use this for any difference of 2 squared. Assuming we have something like x squared minus 9, you can still convert this to a difference of 2 squared by saying x squared minus what? Minus 3 squared, and you can input this formula. So how do we use this formula for our equation? So just put your x as a and put your 2 as b. So we have our x plus 2, and we also have what? X minus 2. So we also have x minus 2, and we say must not be equal to what? 0, because this is how to calculate our domain. It must not be equal to 0. So using this, solving this quadratically, we have what? X plus 2 must not be equal to 0. Likewise, we have x minus 2 must not be equal to what? 0. So in this case, you can take 2 to the other side. So we have x must not be equal to what? Minus 2, and also you can say or x must not be equal to what? Plus 2. So this is our domain for this kind of question. So x must not be equal to what? Minus 2, and x must not be equal to plus 2. So we can now say x must not be equal to plus or what? Minus 2. So this is our final answer to question of this type. So you can see x must not be equal to minus 2 in the option, and that is the final answer to question of this type. So now let's move to the inverse function. So moving to the inverse function, we have the inverse function. So what this inverse function is all about is just that you'll be given a function and you'll be asked to calculate what? The inverse function, which is the what? The, let me just say, like the opposite of the function. So how do we calculate this? Let's say, for example, let's say f of x is equal to 2x plus 3. So how do we calculate the inverse of this function? In order to calculate the inverse of this function, the first step, or the first thing you are going to do is what? You are going to substitute this f of x to be equal to y. So this is the first step. The f of x will be equal to y. So you make it y. So in doing that, we have what? Y to be equal to what? 2x plus 3. So this is the first step. Whenever you want to solve an inverse of a function, you have to make the f of x to be equal to y, or the function, or whatever function you were given, to be equal to what? Y. So once you have done this, the next step is to do is what? To make x the subject of the formula in this equation. So how do we make x the subject of the formula? We can just say that y, you can carry this plus 3 to the other side. So we have y minus 3 to be equal to what? 2x. So in making x the subject of the formula, we have x to be equal to what? Y minus 3 divided by what? 2. So now that we have made x the subject of the formula, the last thing to do to get the inverse of this function is to change this x back to what? F inverse of x. So changing this, we have what? F inverse of x to be equal to what? So once you change this to F inverse of x, you now change this y to x. So we have x minus 3 divided by 2. And this is our final answer to question of this type. So it is as simple as changing the function of x to y first. After that, you now make x the subject of the formula, in which we have x equals to what? Y minus 3 divided by 2. And once you have done that, just change this x to what? F inverse of x, and you now change this y2 to x. So we have F inverse of x equals to what? X minus 3 divided by 2. And that is our final answer to question of this type. So let's look at other examples still under the inverse function. So moving to the next question, as displayed on the screen, you can see the question. The question says f of x equals to what? 5x. So we are to find the inverse of the function. So can you try to pause this video and solve this question? and when I solve it, you mark yourself if you are right or wrong. So pause this video now and give it a go. So yes, in solving this kind of question, we have our f of x to be equal to what? We have 5x. So how do we solve question of this type? Remember that I said that if you want to solve this kind of question, the first thing to do is what? You change the f of x to what? To y. So let's do that. So we have our y to be equal to what? 5x. So this is the first step. You have to change what? The f of x to be equal to y. So you have y equals to what? 5x. So remember that we said what? The f of x is what? Is the function or the, yes, the dependent value of what? Of y. So that is why we have y equals to what? 5x. So now that we have y equals to 5x, the next step to do is what? To make x the subject of the formula. And in doing this, we have our x to be equal to what? Y divided by 5. So this is what you get when you make what? X the subject of the formula. You have this 5, so divided by 5 divided by 5. So you get x equals to what? Y divided by 5. Because when you divide this, so you have y equals to 5x. So you can divide it by 5, divide this by 5. So 5 will cancel this, and you have your x equals to what? Y divided by 5. And that is how we get this. And now that we have gotten this, I said the last step to do is what? Change this s to what? F inverse of x. So we have f inverse of x to be equal to what? So I said once you change this x to f inverse of x, you now change this y to what? X. So we have x divided by 5. And this is our final answer to question of this type. So f inverse of x equals to what? X divided by 5. So option B is correct to this kind of question. You can see it as displayed on the screen. So let's look at the last example, still under the inverse function. The last example, as displayed on the screen, says that if f of x is equal to 2x minus 1 divided by 3, find the what? The inverse function of x. So in this case, we are given our f of x to be equal to what? To be equal to 2x minus 1 divided by 3. And we are asked to find the inverse function of x. So in solving this kind of question, I said the first thing to do is what? Change this f of x to what? To y. So you can see we have been doing it for all the questions. So we have to do it for this also. So this is how you solve inverse function. You just have to change the f of x or whatever function you are giving to y. So in doing this, we have our y to be equal to what? 2x minus 1 divided by 3. So you can see we have changed this f of x to y. So the next step to do is what? You have to what? Make x the subject of the formula. So to make x the subject of the formula, we can cross multiply this. So we have 3y equals to what? 2x minus 1. So when you cross multiply, this will multiply this and this will multiply this. So we have 3 multiplied by y equals to what? 2x minus 1. And that is how we get 3y equals to what? 2x minus 1. So now that we have gotten this, we can take this one back to this function. So we have 3y. So you can see this is minus 1. So when you take it back, it will become what? Plus 1. So 3y plus 1 equals to what? 2x. So now that we have done this, you can now divide both sides by what? 2. In order to cancel these 2 to make x the subject of the formula. So we have our x to be equal to what? So when you divide it by 2, you have 3y plus 1 divided by 2. So now that we have made x the subject of the formula, the last step to do is what? You have to change this x to what? F inverse of x. So in doing this, we have our f inverse of x to be equal to what? So remember that you have to change y. Whenever you see y, you have to change it to what? X. So we have 3x plus 1 divided by 2. And this is our final answer to question of this type. You can see option A is correct to this kind of question. So again, let me recap. The first thing to do is what? Change this f of x to y. So after you change this f of x to y, you make what? X the subject of the formula from the equation. So once you make x the subject of the formula from the equation, you now substitute f inverse of x for x. You change x to what? F inverse of x. And lastly, you now change the y to what? X. So anywhere you see y in the equation, you change it to x. So no matter where the y is, the y can be at the numerator or the y can be at the denominator. So you just have to change it to what? X to get the inverse of the function. Because you can see we have x in this bracket. So whatever that is here must be what? X. So that is how we solve question on inverse function. So this will be all on inverse function. Let's look at the last subtopic, which is what? The composite function. So moving to the last subtopic, we have the what? The composite function. So what this composite function is just all about is by substituting one function for another function inside the function. So let's look at an example and see what this looks like. So the first example, let's just say we have something like if f of x is equal to x squared and g of x is equal to x plus 1. So we have to find f of g of x. So in solving question of this type, you can see we have two functions, f of x and what? G of x. So they are asking us to calculate f of g of x. So this is all what composite function is all about. So this f of g of x, we can rewrite it as what? F open bracket g of x. So this way it is better for simplicity, so we can visualize what we are doing, because if we are to solve it this way, you won't really understand what is going on behind the scene. So that is why you can rewrite it as what? F open bracket g of x. So now going back to this equation, what is g of x? So our g of x is equal to what? X plus 1. So you can see the g of x from the question we are given is what? F plus 1. So we can now input this g of x to this equation. Remember that g of x is now what? X plus 1. So we can have f of what? X plus 1. So yes, you can see what is going on behind the scene. So you can see this g of x is what? X plus 1. So we can put this g of x to this function. So we have f of x plus 1. So remember from what we did earlier, we said what? If we have something like f of x equal to what? Equal to x plus 2. And we are asked to calculate what? F of 1. So we have something like, what is there? We'll substitute it for what? X. So we have something like 1 plus 1. So f of 1 will be equal to 2. So you can see something like that. So we can apply the same thing to this equation. So how do we get f of x plus 1? So to get f of x plus 1, remember that what? F of x is equal to x squared. So whenever we see x in this equation, we'll substitute it for what? X plus 1. So remember that f of x is equal to what? X squared. So our f of x plus 1, so this x plus 1 is what? G of x. So will be equal to what? So remember that we have to substitute whenever we see x in this equation to what? X plus 1. So we have open bracket x plus 1 close bracket square. So we have substitute this x for what? X plus 1. So that is how we are having f of x plus 1 equals to what? X plus 1 square. So our f of g of x will be equal to what? X plus 1 square. So this is our final answer to question of this type. You can see it is visualizing. You can see we dissect it so we can know what is going on behind the scene, and that is how you calculate what? A composite function. So now let's look at examples under the composite function. So the first question as displayed on the screen under the composite function says that if f of x is equal to x squared and g of x is equal to 2x, find f of g of 3. So let me just put that down. So we have our f of x to be equal to what? X squared, and our g of x to be equal to what? 2x. And we have to find what? F of g of 3. So how do we solve question of this type? This question is easier to solve because you can just visualize what is going on in this question. And in order to visualize this, let's just pick what is in this bracket first, which is what? G of 3. So we have g of 3 to be equal to what? So remember that g of x is what? 2x. So that means whenever we see x in g of x, we substitute it for what? 3. So we have g of 3 to be equal to 2 open bracket what? 3. And our g of 3 will be equal to what? 6. So we have gotten g of 3 So you can see g of x is equal to 2x, and g of 3 will be, whenever we see x in g of x, we substitute it for what? 3. So we have g of 3 to be equal to 2 multiplied by 3. So we have g of 3 to be equal to 6. So now that we have gotten g of 3, we can now put that what we got for g of 3 back in this equation. So we have f of g of 3 to be equal to what? F of what? 6. So you can see g of 3 is what? 6, and that is why we have what? F of 6. So in order to get f of 6, we have something like, remember that f of x is what? X squared. So that means whenever we see x in x squared, we substitute it for what? For 6. So in order to do this, we have f of 6 to be equal to what? 6 squared. You can see we have substituted 6 for what? X. So our f of 6 will be equal to what? 36. So we can now say f of g of 3 is equal to 36. And this is our final answer to question of this type. You can see the correct option in the question. So f of g of 3 is equal to what? 36. So you just have to visualize what is going on and take it step by step in order to solve question on composite function. So that is our final answer to question of this type. So let's look at another question still on the composite function. So moving to the third question, as displayed on the screen, the question says if f of x is equal to 2x plus 1 and g of x is equal to x squared, find f of g of x. So in order to solve this kind of question, let me just put that down. So we have our f of x to be equal to 2x plus 1 and our g of x to be equal to what? X squared. So the question is asking us to calculate what? F of g of x. So remember that we can write this as what? F of what? G of x. So this is the better way to write it in order to visualize question of this type. So in order to solve this kind of question, I told you that the first thing to do is to visualize and dissect. So we can just take this g of x first. So recall that g of x is what? Is equal to what? X squared. So now that we have gotten g of x to be equal to x squared, you can now put that x squared in this bracket. So we now have f of what? X squared. Because what? G of x is what? X squared. You can see g of x is x squared from the question. So we can now substitute that g of x for what? X squared. So we have f of what? X squared. So now that we have f of x squared, remember that when we have f of x, so now going back to what the question says about f of x, so the question says f of x is equal to what? 2x plus 1. So what are we going to do to get f of x squared? So that means whenever you see x, you are going to substitute it for what? X squared. So f of x squared will be equal to what? So now we have to open bracket what? X squared. Because whenever we see x, we substitute it for what? X squared. Because that is what we have in this new function. So we now have plus 1. So you can see 2x plus 1. So it will now be 2x squared plus 1. So in this case, our f of x squared will be given as what? 2x multiplied by x squared will give us what? 2x squared plus 1. So we can now go back to what we are asked to find. So f of what? G of x will now be given as what? 2x squared plus 1. So this is our final answer to question of this type. Option A is correct to this kind of question. You can see that in the question displayed on the screen. So option A is correct. So you can see x squared is what? G of x. And that is why we have f of g of x to be equal to what? 2x squared plus 1. So the best way to solve is to what? Take it step by step and dissect it so you won't mix it up together. So this is our final answer to question of this type. So let's look at another question still under the composite function. So moving to the next question as displayed on the screen, the question says if f of x is equal to x squared minus 3 and g of x is equal to 2x, find g of f of 2. So in this kind of question, let me just put that down. So we have our f of x to be equal to what? So we have x squared minus 3 and our g of x to be equal to what? 2x. So the question is now asking us to find what? G of what? Of f of 2. So let me write it the way they write it in the question. So the question is asking us to calculate what? G of f of 2. So remember that we can write this as what? G open bracket f of what? 2. So remember that we can write it this way because this is the simplest way to just visualize what you are doing behind the scene. So we won't mix this up. So in order to solve this question, let's take this f of 2 first. So f of 2 will be equal to what? So remember that f of x is what? X squared minus 3. So our f of 2 will be giving us, whenever we see x in this function, we are going to substitute it for what? 2. So we have our f of 2 to be equal to what? So this will now be 2 squared minus 3. So our f of 2 will be giving us what? 2 squared minus 3, that will be 4 minus 3. So f of 2 will be giving us 1. So you can see we have taken the first step. This question is simple. You just have to keep following the same step to solve this question. Visualize, dissect, and take it step by step. So that is how you solve questions of this type. So now that we have gotten our f of 2 to be equal to what? 1. So we can now see our g of 1. Because why? This is what we are asked to calculate, g of f of 2. So we have gotten f of 2 to be equal to 1. So we can now say g of 1 to be equal to what? Unknown. So remember that our g of x is equal to what? 2x. So g of 1 will be equal to what? So we now have our g of 1 to be equal to, so whenever we see x in this function, we are going to substitute it with what? 1. So our g of x will be equal to what? 2 open bracket 1. So g of x, which is g of 1, will be equal to what? 2. So this is our final answer to question of this type. So 2 is correct. So we can now take this g of 1 back to what? G of f of 2, because f of 2 is what? 1. So our g of f of 2 will be equal to 2. So this is our final answer to question of this type. And you can see from the question displayed on the screen that option A is correct to this kind of question. So let's look at more examples on the composite function. And moving to the next example, the question as displayed on the screen says that if f of x is equal to square root of x and g of x is equal to x plus 4, find f of g of x. So in this kind of question, we are giving our f of x to be equal to what? So to the square root of x, and our g of x to be equal to x plus 4. And the question is asking us to find what? F of g of x. So recall that we can write this f of g of x as f open brackets what? G of x. So this is a better way to write it in order to visualize what is going on behind the scene. So in order to do this, recall that our g of x is what? So our g of x is equal to x plus 4. So now that we have gotten our g of x to be equal to x plus 4, we can put it back in this equation. So we have our f of g of x to be equal to what? F of what? X plus 4. So you can see what we have. So this g of x is what? X plus 4. And that is why we have f of g of x to be equal to what? F of x plus 4. And now that we have gotten f of x plus 4, so we can now calculate f of x plus 4, which is the same thing as f of g of x. So in order to calculate this, recall that we said that this x plus 4 will stand for wherever we see x in this f of x. So whenever you see x in this f of x, you replace it with what? X plus 4. So in doing this, we have our f of x plus 4 to be equal to what? Square root of, because we are having a square root of x plus 4. So this is giving as our final answer to question of this type. So you can just write it as f of what? G of x to be equal to what? Square root of x plus 4. Because what? The x plus 4 is what? The same thing as g of x. So that is why we are having f of g of x to be equal to square root of what? X plus 4. And this is giving as our final answer to question of this type. You can see the correct option as displayed on the screen. So let's move to another example still on the composite function. The next question, as displayed on the screen, says that if f of x is equal to 1 divided by x and g of x is equal to x minus 3, find f of g of x. So let me just put the question down. So we have our f of x to be equal to 1 divided by x and our g of x to be equal to x minus 3. So the question is asking us to find f of g of x. So remember that in order to solve this kind of question, this f of g of x can be written as what? F open bracket what? G of x. So this way you can dissect and visualize. So this g of x is what? So we have our g of x to be equal to x minus 3. So now that we have gotten our g of x to be equal to x minus 3, so we can now say f of what? G of x is equal to what? F of x minus 3. Because our g of x is what? X minus 3. So we can change this g of x to what? X minus 3. So our f of g of x will be equal to f of x minus 3. So now that we have gotten f of g of x to be equal to f of x minus 3, we can now find the f of x minus 3 because you remember that f of x is equal to what? 1 divided by x. So wherever we see x in this equation, we have to substitute it for what? X minus 3. So in doing this, we have our f of x minus 3 to be equal to what? 1 divided by, instead of writing x, we'll substitute it with what? X minus 3. So this is our final answer to question of this type. So instead of writing x minus 3, we can just write it as what? F of g of x, which is what the question asks us to calculate, to be equal to what? 1 divided by x minus 3. And this is our final answer to question of this type. You can see option B is correct to this kind of question. So f of g of x is equal to what? 1 divided by x minus 3. So let's look at the last example still on the composite function. And the last example, as displayed on the screen, says that if f of x is equal to 3x minus 2 and g of x is equal to 4x plus 1, find f of g of x. So in this kind of question, let me just put that down. We have our f of x to be equal to 3x minus 2 and our g of x to be equal to 4x plus 1. So the question is asking us to find f of g of x. So in solving this kind of question, remember that f of g of x can be written as what? F open bracket g of x. So in order to do this, we know that our g of x is equal to what? 4x plus 1. So now that our g of x is equal to 4x plus 1, we can now put that 4x plus 1 to replace what? This g of x, because this is equal to what? G of x. So we now have f of what? G of x to be equal to what? F of 4x plus 1. So now that we have gotten our f of g of x to be equal to f of 4x plus 1, that means that we have to get f of 4x plus 1. So our f of 4x plus 1 will be given as unknown. And in order to get this, remember that f of x is equal to what? 3x minus 2. So that means that wherever we see x in this equation, we have to substitute it with what? 4x plus 1. So in doing this, we have our f of 4x plus 1 to be equal to, so we have our 3. So 3x. So instead of writing 3x, we have to substitute it with what? 4x plus 1. So we have 3 open bracket 4x plus 1, because we have to substitute this x with what? 4x plus 1. And we now have minus 2. So our f of 4x plus 1 will be given as 3 multiplied by 4x will give us 12x. So we have 3 multiplied by 3 will give us plus 3. And we have minus 2. So our final answer, which is f of 4x plus 1, will be given as 12x plus 1. So our final answer is what? 12x plus 1. So we can write this f of 4x plus 1 as what? F of g of x. So we now have f of g of x, because this is what the question is asking us to calculate, to be equal to what? 12x plus 1. So this is our final answer to question of this type. And this will be all on the composite function and all about the function of real variable. So if this video help you understand function of real variable, don't forget to like this video and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any lesson from Tech and EduSpark. And until next time, keep learning, keep coding, and I will see you in the next one.